The assumption about matter that failed first. Matter once felt solid, reliable, unquestionable. Things were either there or they were not. Objects occupied space and stayed put. This belief felt so obvious it barely qualified as an assumption. Matter had substance, boundaries, location. You could point to it, touch it, weigh it. Physics was built on that certainty. The entire framework of classical science rested on the assumption that matter was the most basic and reliable category of existence, the foundation on which all other concepts were constructed. To understand why this matters today, we need to return to the comfort of early models. Atoms were tiny billiard balls. Particles were points with positions. Even when fields entered the picture, matter itself still felt anchored. It existed somewhere specific at every moment. That assumption worked beautifully at human scales. Tables stayed tables. Stones stayed stones. Even molecules behaved predictably when averaged together. Matter appeared cooperative, obedient to common sense. At the scales of everyday life, the behavior of matter was so consistent and predictable that the idea of it being anything other than solid, located, and definite seemed not just unlikely but absurd. But when experiments began probing individual particles, the picture fractured. Particles refused to stay put. Their positions smeared. Attempt to pin them down produced probabilities instead of coordinates. Matter behaved less like substance and more like behavior. At first, this was blamed on measurement limits. Surely particles had positions we simply could not access. But every refinement made the same result clearer. There was no hidden location waiting to be revealed. Location itself was not always defined. The particle did not have a position that was merely unknown. It existed in a state where the concept of position had not yet been determined, a distinction far more radical than simple ignorance. This was the first assumption about matter to fail, not because physics became vague, but because it became precise. Matter did not consist of tiny objects sitting in space. It consisted of possibilities constrained by interaction. Once that was accepted, solidity itself became suspect. Matter was no longer something that simply existed somewhere. It was something that appeared somewhere when conditions demanded it. And with that realization, the most basic idea of what matter is began to dissolve. At first, physicists tried to rescue the old picture. Maybe particles still had precise positions, just hidden beneath uncertainty. Maybe deeper variables existed, quietly carrying the information that experiments could not reach. But every attempt to restore solidity failed. No hidden coordinates appeared. No deeper layer fixed the problem. The more carefully matter was examined, the more it behaved like a spread of possibilities rather than a thing with edges. This created a deep conflict with intuition. Matter was supposed to occupy space. If it did not, then what did it mean to exist at all? Physics had always treated existence as location. Now location itself was conditional. Experiments made this impossible to ignore. Particles interfered with themselves. They appeared in places they should not be. They followed paths only when forced to. Left alone, they behaved as if they were nowhere in particular. The concept of a particle existing at a specific location, which seemed like the most basic and inarguable fact about physical objects, turned out to be an approximation that broke down completely at the scales where the true nature of matter was revealed. This reframed matter entirely. It was no longer a collection of tiny objects. It was a set of potential interactions. Matter existed not as substance, but as probability constrained by rules. It became real when measured, not before. Emotionally, this was unsettling. Solidity had felt like the last refuge of certainty. Energy could be abstract, fields could be invisible, but matter was supposed to be tangible. Now even that anchor was gone. By this point, the assumption about matter had fully collapsed. Matter did not fail because it was misunderstood. It failed because it was never what intuition claimed. It was not something sitting in space. It was something waiting to happen. A set of possibilities held in suspension, ready to resolve into a definite outcome when the conditions for resolution were met, but genuinely indeterminate until that moment arrived. The conflict deepened when physicists realized this was not a flaw limited to tiny scales. The same rules that blurred particles also governed everything built from them. Solidity, it turned out, was an emergent illusion, not a fundamental feature. Atoms felt solid because electromagnetic forces resisted overlap. Objects felt rigid because probabilities were tightly constrained. But beneath that stability, matter never stopped behaving like possibility. Even the most solid wall was mostly empty space, held together by rules, not substance. This buildup revealed a disturbing implication. Matter did not exist as a thing first, and interact second. Interaction came first. Existence followed. Without interaction, matter had no definite location, no fixed boundaries, no single identity. This reversed a deep assumption. Physics had always treated matter as primary and forces as secondary. Now it was clear that forces, interactions, and constraints defined what matter could be. Substance was not the foundation. Behavior was. Emotionally, this was difficult to accept. It meant that the world felt solid not because it truly was, but because uncertainty was tightly managed at large scales. Stability was not a given. It was maintained. The solidity of the everyday world was not a passive property of matter, but an active achievement of the forces and interactions that constrained uncertainty into narrow enough channels to produce the appearance of permanence. By this point, matter no longer looked like the basic ingredient of reality. It looked like a pattern that emerged when probabilities were forced into narrow channels. Remove those constraints, and matter dissolved back into possibility. The assumption about matter that failed first did not collapse loudly. It faded quietly, replaced by a deeper view where existence depended on interaction, not location. The climax of this story is a quiet reversal. Matter did not lose its solidity because physics became abstract. It was never solid in the way intuition imagined. Once this is understood, matter stops being a thing and starts being an agreement. A stable pattern enforced by interactions, probabilities, and constraints. What feels solid is not substance. It is consistency. This insight reshaped how physics understands existence. Objects do not persist because they occupy space. They persist because the rules tightly restrict how they can change. Stability is not a property of matter itself. It is a property of the forces that bind possibilities into narrow ranges. More deeply, it reshapes humility. The world feels tangible because uncertainty is hidden, not because it is absent. Beneath every surface lies motion, fluctuation, and probability, held in check just enough to feel real. Today, this perspective quietly underpins modern physics and technology. It explains why matter can tunnel, fluctuate, and transform, why solidity breaks down at extremes, why existence itself depends on interaction. The assumption about matter that failed first did not leave emptiness behind. It left a richer picture, a universe where things do not simply exist. They are continually maintained. Matter is not what sits in space. It is what happens when the universe repeatedly agrees to behave the same way. And that agreement, sustained across countless interactions and enforced by the deepest rules of physics, is what gives the world its texture, its reliability, and its substance. Subscribe to join the journey. The